at ASA, organized by Monica Prasad, which is titled Theory in the World's Problems, Perspectives on Using Sociology to Create Change. So you can look for that as one of our section events. And the second is that for the first time, we're starting a mentorship program for section members. So I'm going to drop the Zoom, form, the link for the Google form to participate in the mentorship program into the chat. It's open for all section members, and you can sign up by May 22nd. So those were my two quick theory section announcements. I should have introduced myself. I'm Maggie Frye, chair of the theory section, and have co-organized this panel today with Ioana Sendroiu and Jordan Fox. So I'm going to now hand it over to Ioana, who will explain the logistics of how this will work. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. We're absolutely thrilled at the turnout. I'm not going to say too much because just wanted to get started. So we're going to hear from our presenters in order, and then for you to have a discussant. And presenters and discussants know that I will unmute myself and be very mean and give you a time warning and cut you off so that we have some time for discussion at the end. Q&A, we have a Q&A function set up, so you can post your questions there. You can also put them in the chat, and you can also direct them, send them directly to Jordan Fox, who's going to be running the Q&A at the very end of, after we've heard from everyone. So that's it from me, and I'll pass it off to Daniel Aldana Cohen, who's also presenter.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I am thrilled to be here, starting my clock. I'm thrilled to be here and to share some initial ideas that I've been mulling with. Please forgive the chaos of early thinking. On September 9th, 2020, the sky in the Bay Area turned red, and images went viral and around the world. But it's not just in the Bay Area that the sky has turned red in recent years because of wildfire smoke. This has been happening all over the world. Something that's interesting when you look into this is you also find headlines like sky over Gaza turns red from a night of bombing. And I think that reminds us that this emergency we're in is not an emergency separate from emergencies of colonial violence, but really these are the same story. My question is, how would we do sociology differently if we saw the sky as red every day? I try to maintain the discipline of looking out the window and seeing the sky as red. And I think that when it looks blue to me, that's not so much information about the world outside my window as it is information about institutional complicity in the institutions where we work in universities. So I think part of the red sky idea is urgency, but part of it is recognizing forces beyond social forces and facts beyond social facts. So what is this broader world then that I'm talking about? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the word terraforming as making another planet suitable for human life. And I might amend that to say, if we look at the environmental history of capitalism, that terraforming could also describe making this planet suitable for capitalist development, which has had enormous consequences. We can summarize some of the obvious ones. There's more carbon in the atmosphere than there has been in 14 million years. If you take the entire mass of every mammal on Earth, 96% of that mass is made up of by humans, our pets, and our livestock. If you add up the weight of all life on Earth, it's about 1.1 teratons. If you add up the weight of all the physical built environment, asphalt, concrete, bricks, it's 1.1 teratons. They are now the same weight. So this is a human planet, as Earth system scientists Lewis and Maslin have said. And so I'd suggest then that we could think of the whole history of capitalism as essentially what I'd call terraforming one, a period of uncontrolled terraforming, making the world suitable for capitalist development with no control for environmental externalities. And where we're heading, I think, is something you could call terraforming two, controlled terraforming, making the planet suitable for human and non-human life to flourish. This, I think, is basically the meta frame for most political projects that we're heading toward. Now, my point of this presentation is not to say what this should look like. This could be very passive. It could look like rewilding. It could be very active. It could look like geoengineering, which I would not be that excited about. But fundamentally, I think that future is about kind of controlling our relationship to the planet. And largely that comes through the built environment. The red sky sociology then would be naming this emergency phase of transition. And what's largely happening, I think, is changing the human relationship to the planet through reconstructing the built environment. This is where sociology comes into contact with fields like geography, planning, engineering, development economics, agrarian studies, decolonial land politics, and so on. I think this is true north and south. So this environmental turn is also a kind of biophysical turn and an empirical turn that puts a lot of pressure on kind of on traditions of general sociological theorization. I think we could also note that in the decolonial version, the environmental turn really points out that sociology's implicit society versus nature binary is an artifact of colonial ideology. So this to me is the kind of frame of what we're coming to pay attention to. This isn't an alternative to sociology's kind of bread and butter contribution on questions of inequality. This is the story of inequality. Historically, the story of the production, maintenance, reproduction of inequalities is the story of this kind of construction of the built environment. In the US, we could even talk about redlining in suburbs. In the years to come, I'd argue, it's through struggles to reconstruct the built environment that we will have new stories and new forms of inequality, like entrenching eco-apartheid, or deconstructing inequalities like through by building multiracial economic democracies. But that will be a physical question. Okay, so now about this landscape, let me offer 4 theses. The first thesis I'm basically going to skip. I think it's quite obvious. Sociology knew, in the same way that the fossil fuel companies knew, environmental sociology has been challenging mainstream sociology for decades. Mainstream sociology has utterly ignored it. Now, some make us think that if we just add a few environmental sociologists here and there, everything will be fine. That's obviously not true. For the discipline to make a meaningful contribution to defining what a terraforming 2 might look like will require radical change. And I discussed a few ideas what that might look like in thesis 4. Okay, my second thesis. We need to go back to the future and then from the future back to the present. Most climate change hasn't happened yet. Terraforming 2 hasn't happened yet. So if we want to grapple with these forces, we have to anchor our analysis not just in the present or past, but really in the future. Otherwise, we're stuck just studying the most boring versions of climate social life, where we just follow around people who say the words climate and environment a lot. Now, obviously, there's a place for that, but it's incongruous to think that we would study the biggest issue ever by talking to a tiny group of nerds. And we all, I think, intuitively know that doesn't make sense. Now, we would need then methods for organizing research on the present and the recent past in light of our best expectations for the future. The good news is that, as strange as that sounds, that is literally the history of sociology and social thought. So the most famous version of this, of course, is the Marxist project, or take the Communist Manifesto. As Eric Hobsbawm wrote, Marx and Engels didn't describe the world as it had been transformed by capitalism in 1848. They predicted how it was logically destined to be transformed by it. And that idea of recasting the present in light of expected future is all over the history of social thought. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Weber's idea of the iron cage, Du Bois on Black Reconstruction, which is in many ways a story of the New Deal and even the Civil Rights and Great Society era, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, Lefebvre's Urban Revolution, Turenne and Bell on the Post-Industrial Society, which got a lot wrong, but were extremely influential. So my version of this, rereading the present in light of the future and using categories from the expected future to analyze the present, I call that social backcasting. But we could talk more about that in Q&A. I also think this is the one reason why the indigenous and decolonial turns are so important, because they don't just multiply the past that we think with, but they also multiply the futures that we can think with. And what do those indigenous and decolonial alternative futures focus on? Different relationships to the land and other living beings, or what I would categorize under terraforming 2. Okay, thesis 3 is that there are kind of 4 big C's that climate sociology needs to center, not exclusively, but that belong at the center of our collective endeavor: capitalism, carbon, coalitions, and causal explanation, in a capacious sense, not the narrow sense. And basically the idea is that we owe it to the world to provide good explanations of what does or doesn't contribute to preventing ecological breakdown. And if we can't provide that, what are we doing as critical social scientists or even as sociologists? And the flip side is we can make an enormous contribution if we can illuminate causal processes that do prevent calamity or that don't. And along the way, I would kind of urge an eco-Gramscian turn that really focuses on how different groups are building different blocks or coalitions that are congealing different projects of green political economy under this red sky. So crudely, how are different coalitions coalescing around different responses? And I think there's a question of how certain political blocks are forming around the forces of ecofascism, which is physically characterized by fortresses of solitude, AI-optimized concentration camps, violent borders, and we see that in the world. Other elites are trying to build coalitions around a kind of centrist, state-led green capitalism, based on a new quote unquote green extraction with enormous contradictions and churning landscape transformations. And we might think about how other blocks might form around forces like unions and social movements for projects like eco-socialism with hyper-efficient green social housing built out of low-carbon concrete and regional biomaterials. And one could go on. Okay, my last thesis concerns how can sociology take on these questions? Yeah, I think I have 2 minutes. And I want to say that there are 3 basic ways that we can do this: assimilation, transformation, and contribution. The assimilation idea is that we domesticate climate into a normal social problem. Now, nobody would really advocate this because it's obviously not a very attractive idea. Yet that is in fact the career advice that is generally given to people studying climate change in practice, or that is how you get into a leading journal or get into a panel that doesn't have climate in the title. There are obvious drawbacks to trying to do that. There's a transformation model which says, let's transform sociology and dialogue with climate and environmental science. Now, I think that is the right thing to do, but it's worth noting a kind of symmetry between assimilation and transformation. They both, in a sense, see the ASA and the journals and the departments as the terrain of struggle. And I think paradigms die pretty hard, and I don't know how quickly transformation can happen. So I would endorse it. But I would argue that a third model, the contribution model, can rescue the radical impulse of transformation. But instead of seeing the domain of contribution as changing sociology as such, it is building an interdisciplinary climate social science to inform public action around reconstructing the built environment, or terraforming too. So I would argue that the contribution model can actually mutually enforce with the transformation model. The two can go together, but I think in this moment, under a red sky, I would urge us to collectively think, how can we contribute to this project, to informing groups that are making an impact? And I mean that literally, like concretely, literally, around concrete and other changes to the built environment. Okay, thank you for coming with me on this very rapid spoken journey.
Thank you, and that was right on time. Julie, your comment, your remark.
Thank you. I'm Juliet Schor. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Daniel, for this very thought-provoking and really great piece. So let me just start by saying I absolutely agree about sociology's failure to address the ecological crisis or the polycrisis more generally. But I do want to say this is not just a problem of sociology. It is, in fact, a problem of all the social sciences. I mean, you see the same thing in them. I've done the most on economics, but there you have the problem of the quote unquote environment or ecological systems, which have been literally externalized from the core of the discipline in the same way that sociology cordoned off environmental sociology into a kind of low prestige subfield. A word of caution: ecological economics attempted to do in some ways what you are talking about, which was to transform the discipline. And it insisted on the sort of core principle, ecological core principles, which needed to be present in all economics work. And it's been an utter failure. I mean, please don't broadcast that I'm saying this, but ecological economics ended up reproducing some of the mainstream's most problematic methods and imploding over an attempt to put a price on the world's ecosystem services. And it just sort of, it's a very sad tale. So this is a fraught enterprise, what you're talking about. How do you do it? Well, I absolutely agree with the point.
Leo,
Daniel,
what you doing?
Oh, this is the second time I've been, I hope that's not a Zoom bombing. Okay. That studying inequality, and especially racial inequality, I would add, is a real strong point of sociology, and putting it together with the study of climate is absolutely key. After all, the climate crisis is at its root an inequality. And that accounts for its origins, perpetuation.
It's supposed to be 77 today.
Climate.
Julie, I just muted everyone just so that we could stop whoever was talking, and then I think you can just unmute yourself. Sorry about that. That was just to get us 1 second. Oh, 1 second. I think you're muted again. And would you mind just doing that? Sorry.
Okay, so
Perfect.
how do we do that? I think the first thing I want to say is we have to retain some level of specialization. I just went to a presentation by a natural scientist who's talking about sort of EJ and sociological issues. And it was like at the level of a first week undergraduate. I could go on for days about the engineers that I've engaged with over the years who write on consumption issues. So let's remember, we all have a lane. Let's stay in our lane and collaborate from our lane to not lose all of what we know. Now, I always ask my students who study climate change, what is different about the fact that this is a climate problem you're talking about? So, for example, if they're studying a climate social movement, how does this differ from any other social movements? And what you're going to see is, in part, there will be similarities, but there are also going to be differences. Why? Because climate is different. I mean, I don't always know the answer to my question, but I do know that because decarbonization involves just about everything, changing the economic system, the built environment, our ethics, philosophy, because, as Daniel would say, carbon is everywhere. It means it's a different kind of problem than what we normally face, which has a little bit more boundedness. I mean, some are less bounded than others. Inequality, racial inequality is not a super bounded question, but there's almost no boundedness here. So I think it's time to get to what I'll call the meso level here. I'm not sure if that's really the right word. It's really sectoral, I think, but not the household. I think that is not the best place to be, and not the macro economy, especially at the global, but sector by sector, because one of the things we've learned as we sort of go deeper into understanding climate is that the solutions are very sectoral. There is not the economists want the carbon price, and that solves everything. And we know that is wrong. So Daniel's focus on housing is a good example. Personally, I'm working on the 4-day week. It's a concrete but far-reaching change, but it's a labor focus. So I do think there are many more of these opportunities, and we need to get to work on them. And I think that fits into his contribution model. Let me end with a hopeful anecdote. Recently got a call from someone I barely know. I'd met her maybe once, a senior person in a sociology department at a prestige university. They were tired of working on what they'd spent the first 15 years of their career on, and they started investigating other topics. And they looked at poverty and they thought, no, we already know too much about that. And then they lit on climate change. And the first thing they realized was how utterly ignorant they were about what was happening. I mean, they were like a normal sociologist. Of course, they knew climate change was a problem and so forth. But when they started reading it, they were so horrified at how little they understood what was going on, and how their head had been in the sand for so long. And that, I think, that characterizes large numbers of people. So they said they cared about the red sky, but they'd never seen it really. So the first step is to try and convert, many of our colleagues. And what I am doing with this person now is we are hoping to start a network within our region so that it's train. You can go get to these meetings by train and Zoom, and of people who are sort of new to climate research, because of just sort of coming into the groups that have been there for decades is a little bit daunting. So please be in touch if you are in the Northeast. If you live elsewhere, start one yourself. And I think we really need to sort of get moving on that front. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Daniel, I know it's tempting to respond, but let's keep it for later. And just move right along to Rebecca and her presentation.
Thanks so much. I mean, I want to keep talking about Daniel and Juliet's remarks, but I'll take us into slightly different terrain, quite different terrain. So first, let me just say thank you to the organizers, to all of you for being here this afternoon where I am on Zoom. Thank you particularly to Jeff Olick for agreeing to be my respondent. I'm going to base my contribution around a new project that I'm planning to begin fieldwork for in the fall. So I'm going to somewhat ponderously explore three big sociological areas that are part of what make this emerging empirical situation so interesting to me, and I hope, obviously, for the sake of this afternoon, more broadly illuminating. And that empirical situation is this. Tintagel Castle is falling into the sea. The medieval fortification, which is perched on the cliff tops of the North Cornwall coast, is one of England's most famous historical sites. King Arthur is said to have been conceived on the spot where the castle stands. It was built in the early 13th century by Richard, the first Earl of Cornwall, in part because of that Arthurian connection. So old as it is to the casual observer, the castle is a ruin. What stands today are the remains of the walls that frame a commanding view of the coastline and the sea beyond. But to English Heritage, which is the organization that manages the castle, Tintagel is one of the historical sites in England most threatened by climate change. So in the summer of 2022, English Heritage launched a fundraising appeal to protect and strengthen Tintagel and many other sites. And this fundraising campaign is one of many steps that British heritage and conservation organizations have taken in recent years to address the impacts that climate change is having on this broader project of heritage preservation. These organizations are charged with preserving not only historic buildings, so castles, forts, the stately homes that you see in the movies, but also conserving many natural areas. They are privileged actors in the narration of the country's history and patrimony. They're also economically important to the tourism industry. And right now, they are confronting these questions about what to preserve versus what to let go, how to commemorate what cannot or will not be saved from coastal erosion, rising sea levels, and recurrent flooding. So what is at stake here then, conceptually, theoretically, for the big questions in sociology? Most broadly, I think this interests me because it offers a way to think about climate change, not just as a problem of future transformation or as a problem of present disasters, but also a problem of the past, specifically the always and already fragile and contentious project of stabilizing historical accounts, artifacts, and landscapes. We boomerang across. People work feverishly in the present to preserve a particular version and vision of the past in anticipation of a future that seems to promise more and more losses of culturally resonant relics and places. And so there are three more specific avenues of inquiry that I'd like to set out. So one way to characterize the motivation behind this workshop is that it reflects the growing acknowledgement that climate change touches every facet of social life. This is something that I believe, it's something that I've argued in my own writing. But empirically, I'm curious to know, in the context of this new project, whether climate change really changes anything at all. So after all, heritage and conservation professionals have always been confronting loss, decay, and ruination. In a sense, that's their whole job. So a stately home and all of the antiques inside of it are not entirely unlike Fernando Dominguez Rubio's art museum and his fabulous book, Still Life, a collection of, quote, slowly unfolding disasters, where every single object in these rooms is slowly inching towards its own disappearance. Coastlines are always changing, castles are always crumbling. So what kind of threat is climate change to those places and to those things? Is it a quantitatively more intense version of normal, or is it somehow qualitatively distinct? So if we stay with the example of Tintagel Castle, the castle has been subject to constant erosion, which was the likely cause of a partial collapse as early as 1337. By 1600, the site was largely deserted. The ruins became a tourist destination in the Victorian period. So the version of Tintagel Castle that today's heritage professionals are seeking to stabilize is one that already bore the marks of climatic influence in the 19th century. So not all decay is bad. The decay to date is aesthetically evocative. It's rich with folkloric significance. Anything further, though, must be slowed, if not stopped. So there's a question here, one that maybe travels beyond this case, about the identification of impact, case decay and aging, that is regarded as quotidian. So not necessarily acceptable, but at least expected. And that which is regarded as exceptional or dramatic or otherwise problematic. I have another set of ideas here related to climate change as a justification for intervention, but for the sake of time, I'll move on to the next set of concerns, which is about value, worth, and the question of limits. So valuation suffuses heritage practice. The impulse to preserve a stately home, to conserve what are here called national landscapes, implies that these sites and areas have value. The value of these places may be intuitive to their caregivers or caretakers, and to many British people beside. I'm hoping to leverage my outsider's naivete, I'm not British, to ask people to make that intuitive explicit. What are these places worth? And what does climate change threaten precisely? And precisely what ways does the past have value? I identify in part as an economic sociologist, and so my interest in value and valuation encompasses a question about the place of economic reasoning in all of this. We know that expressing the value of something in pounds and pence makes it easier to compare things against one another, to articulate the necessity of something, to justify spending money. So I'm curious to know if these organizations interpret and articulate the threat of climate change, at least in part, in economic terms. And what might be really interesting to explore empirically and analytically is this question of limits. So Roy Livney has powerfully taken this up using the case of end-of-life care, where medicine must contend with the dilemma of when to, quote, allow death to occur. He shows how limits are set in practice through the coalescing of different regimes of valuation, which he defines as relatively organized and enduring patterns of ascribing cultural, moral, and financial worth to people, behaviors, qualities, and objects. And as Livney notes, the problem of climate change is in significant ways the problem of limits in the sense of planetary boundaries. I'm interested in an intersection that's perhaps even closer to the case of end-of-life caregivers, how climate change enters discussions of basically when to allow a castle to die. How do people decide what will be defended and for how long? What can be washed away? How do they commemorate that which is beyond their limits? What kinds of losses do they believe lie within their control and which ones exceed it? Again, the world of heritage practice has always had to contend with limits, but there seems to be this developing sense that climate change is provoking new orientations to and ambivalence about some of these questions. And finally, there's a set of questions here about the relationships between climate change, identity, and collective memory. As someone who's absolutely not expert in these areas of sociology, my ideas here are especially gestural, and why I was so keen to have Jeff as a respondent. So the first point to make is that climate change is a cultural phenomenon on top of everything else that it is. It's narrated differently in different places and at different scales. So maybe learning something about the incorporation of climate change into preservation and commemoration can tell us something about the cultures doing it, their attachments, their anxieties, their fissures. So in my case, that means contextualizing these climate-related activities in a particular and perhaps peculiar English fondness for the pastoral idol. It also means relating the climate work to ongoing efforts to reckon with colonialism and slavery. Many of the houses and estates that ostensibly need saving were built with the wealth of plantation slavery. So the broader project of pursuing climate reparations, to the extent that it involves rupturing the continuum of extractivism, which spans from colonial genocide and slavery to climate change, in the words of Amari Jacqueline Brown, undoubtedly has much to say about the presumed need to repair the relics and buildings that are created along that continuum, rather than the exploitative relations that underlie it. When heritage and conservation organizations identify climate change as a threat to national patrimony and historical representations, we of course have to ask, whose patrimony, whose history? So in trying to understand the construction of climate change as a social problem for different publics and professionals, we would then need to be attentive to how that construction bears the marks of the divisions and hierarchies in my case, British life. More broadly, I'm interested in exploring whether climate change is enrolled in historical preservation as a part of history or apart from history, or perhaps in some ways both, and whether that might shape what changes and what stays the same in a society's memory of its past, to quote Robin Wagner Pacifici. Does awareness of climate change alter the way that these organizations represent the past? It's probably too soon to know empirically, but I want to keep that question in mind. We can imagine, for instance, the emergence of memories of a pre-climate changed Britain that interact in complex ways with the actual long history of climate change, which Daniel discussed. So I hope the project in general takes up the invitation of Olick and Takler to think about the intersection of crisis and memory, in their words, crises of memory in the present moment, and the roles of memory in the current crises. And in this case, the crisis being the environmental crisis. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And that dovetails really nicely to Jeff and his comments.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Okay, so thanks, first of all, to the organizers of this session. What I really like about this format is, you know, we have two usual formats of presentation and discussion. One is when something's completely finished and here are the results, ta-da, in which case commentary is not particularly useful. In the second format is works in progress, where a fair chunk of the work has been done and people need advice on how to polish it or finish it or what needs to be added before the end. So I really like this idea of having a discussion at an earlier stage of people's projects in public, a sort of what's the word, free sky, or, you know, open sky thinking, how we can help each other at the beginnings of our formulation. So I really like that. I'm also really grateful to Rebecca for this really interesting paper, stimulates a lot of thinking. I should say that the topic here is the strange discontinuities and out of jointness of time. And for me, it strikes particularly close to home, since Rebecca informed me, even though I didn't remember, that some 20 years ago, she was in my undergraduate theory classes. So I'm feeling a little bit out of joint myself. Time goes very quickly. In reading Rebecca's paper and thinking about the interesting issues she raises, I was reminded of a bumper sticker I frequently see, which is, it says something to the effect of everything changes and it's right on schedule. The thing about climate change, and the thing about our present awareness of the accelerating importance of climate change, is that things are not changing on schedule. Things are changing much faster than any schedule that we are used to. And I would say that the challenge, when the topic of this seminar is sociology's big questions, it seems to me that sociology has not done a particularly good job at working at time scales of either the geological or the climactic. And that what I really like about this paper and about this session in general is the challenge it poses to sociology to think in temporal frames and about temporal frames within temporal frames that we're not used to thinking. We have, you know, the event and the conjuncture and the longue durée, and very few sociologists work at the longue durée, or we need a fourth term, obviously, to move us beyond the longue durée of 2,000 or so years, and to start thinking about 2 million years and the like. So this all contributes to my view of the importance of history and temporality in sociology's big questions. I still love the chapter of Norbert Elias's, what is his introduction to sociology, called Sociology's Retreat into the Present. So this is, it seems to me, a very direct revision of the structure of contemporary sociology. One of the reasons I work on memory is because I'm interested in temporality. Memory, it seems to me, is the mechanism of confronting the continuous change in which we live. The fact is, our lives unfold in time, not as structures in space, yes, those too, but unfold temporally through history. And our greatest task is to sort of engage in what Garfinkel, in a very different context, used to refer to as prospective retrospective thinking, or reckoning. And so I work on memory because I'm interested in this prospect of retrospective, prospective temporal reckoning. And that's why heritage is so interesting. Heritage scholars, heritage practitioners live in this fluidity. They live on this river of time, which sometimes flows fast and sometimes flows slowly. And they seek to try to understand and, in fact, to respond to that fluidity, when things seem to be moving too quickly, when things seem to be moving too slowly. We search for anchors, we search for grips. And when a ruin falls off the cliff because of accelerating man-made climate change, we seem to need these holds ever more than we have before. And so I think that heritage studies and memory studies as part of heritage studies is, and rightly should, move to the center of sociological analysis. I can tell you a little bit about some of that work that's been going on, and Rebecca's will be a terrific contribution to this kind of work in heritage studies. There's a movement going on in memory studies that looks at what's called slow memory. 1 minute, yeah. Jenny Wustenberg, up the road from Rebecca in Nottingham, has a cost project on what's called slow memory, which is trying to address, sociologists of memory look at this particular commemoration or how we're going to remember something 10 years later. We need a shift of focus towards these long-term mega historical kinds of processes. And so Rebecca's work seems to me to be especially promising in this regard. So I urge a conversation with the slow memory concept. The other thing about memory studies and heritage studies is, of course, there's something inherently dishonest in the work of heritage. I mean, acknowledgedly dishonest, that we're trying to somehow slow things down and find something to grab onto. I actually there's a new movement of particularly artistic projects which are grasping, recognizing, documented the rapidity, the increasing rapidity of the kinds of changes we see when things like castles fall into the ground. And just to show that sociology hasn't entirely ignored these processes, I'd just like to make a pitch for one of my favorite classic essays, which is Georg Zimmel's essay on the ruin, where he draws a distinction between the ruin and the relic, and makes the point about how important ruins are for the self-understanding of modernity. So there is a tradition within sociology of thinking in these mega historical terms, but it has been lost, I think, in the last 50 years of mid-range theorizing about recent events and trying to understand exactly what's going on now, rather than to try to understand now as part of much longer context. So thanks, Rebecca, and I really look forward to ongoing conversations and to seeing what the results of this work are.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Let's move right along to our last presenter. Patrick, I think you didn't have slides, so I'll just find you and pin your video. Oh. Are we missing Patrick? Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hey everyone, is it my turn?
Yeah, your turn.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm having some technical difficulties at home, so I'm using my cellular network. So having said all that, I'm sorry to have messed the last bit of Rebecca Elliott's presentation. I was really interested in it, and Jeffrey Olick's comments on it. But I'm going to go ahead and try to present from my phone here, and I hope you can be patient with me. I know I've got a short bit of time, and I'm going to be presenting something that I've been preparing, a theoretical framework of sorts to deal with some empirical observations that I and others have made in the literature. So especially given that I'm on my phone, I hope you don't mind, I'll be reading this to you to try to get it in the time limit here. But I'll try to do so engagingly nonetheless. So what I'm interested in thinking about and trying to understand better are what are called oftentimes the ecological paradoxes. And these are so named because they're instances of surprising results in the function of particular socio-ecological relationships. Recent quantitative efforts, for instance, have found the introduction of novel alternative technologies, like those required for the establishment of a renewable electricity production and distribution infrastructure, often fail to result in the removal or the reduced use of previously existing technological artifacts. This is usually referred to as the displacement paradox, but following Sullivan and Harper, some people call it the paperless office paradox. In discussions of displacement or the effect of novel or improved physical technologies on the social processes they're introduced to. There's an assumption of systems dynamics that's at work. More specifically, there's an assumption of a field of relations between actors, technologies, and other actors that results in certain desirable or undesirable outcomes in social and environmental processes that might be considered external to the system in question, and then often are internal to it in quite obvious ways. Indeed, as Eugene Rosa and Lauren Richter have suggested in their past work, the idea of sustainability itself suggests a systems perspective or model of macro-social dynamics as it embeds, quote, the presupposition that there exists a functional relationship between the biological processes of ecosystems and the structural adaptability and continuity of societies. So in many ways, systems are well-trod theoretical ground, and I'm sure this group's familiar with the objections that have been raised to them in the past. Nevertheless, many people have said systems just in the presentations that came before this one today, and it's something that's deeply embedded in our thinking. The problems with them, right, are that they can easily lend themselves to being overly focused on stability. They can reify observed functions as natural, beneficial, and inevitable, and they can be suggestive of uniformity and permanence in the functions we observe in them. In this way, systems approaches end up placing more emphasis on the substances involved in the system than the relations among those substances. And in light of a relational turn in the field of sociology, a systems theory needs to be made to focus more on these relational processes rather than the parts or the components involved in the system or that constitutes the system. And there are many attempts to try to make systems theory, I think, more amenable to this. For instance, scholars such as Lohman focus on developing objective benchmarks by which to bound or appropriately scope a system of study, such as the capacity for self-organization, or in his case, autopoiesis. Hughes, however, Thomas Hughes, that is, offers what I think is a better approach to this, providing a more subjective framework to problem identification or system scoping. For Hughes, there's always a political element in bounding systems such that the function of the system can be outlined in ways that are favorable to the analyst in exploring it. So what a system is itself a subjective question. Systems are both, quote, socially constructed and society shaping, as Hughes would have it, and they can scale up or down, nesting, quote, hierarchically into patterns of systems and subsystems. Despite the relative flexibility of Hughes' approaches to socio-technical systems, there are many limits that remain. First, Hughes tends to suggest that systems have a universal functionality that empirical descriptions of systems often suggest are simply not accurate. For instance, there's increasing reason to believe, as scholars such as Sophia Noble, Virginia Eubanks, Catherine Crawford, and Ruha Benjamin have reminded us in the space of AI, machine learning, and other systems emerging from ongoing development of algorithmic power. Systems, even well-organized and formally structured ones, don't function in the same way or to the same ends for all populations or individual users who have access to and are incorporated into them. In the words of Andreas Venner, artifacts do indeed have politics, and a useful approach to systems is likely one in which the cultural schemas, signifiers, or technologies that inform those politics are also being considered, as well as just the objects that constitute them. I would say that in some respects, this is lacking from Hughes' theory of socio-technical systems. So to address these limitations to Hughes' notion of socio-technical systems, I draw on the insights of two very impactful young theorists, Ruha Benjamin and Jenny Davis. Davis artfully explores the design thinking concept of affordances, which I'm putting it far too coarsely here, but refers to the capabilities or outputs of an artifact yields for a given user or a set of users. Davis notes that this concept, which was put forward by James Gibson in the 1940s, suffers from some of the same conceptual difficulties of many of the systems theories. Namely, it postulates a homogeneous affordance for its users. For Davis, however, it's evident that any artifact can variably encourage, discourage, request, demand, refuse, and allow some uses. She refers to these tendencies as the mechanisms by which artifacts are designed and afford their users various capabilities and outputs. These mechanisms are differentially activated when certain conditions of affordance are met. Davis defines these conditions as the perception of an artifact and how it can be used that a user might hold. The dexterity or skill that can be called on when engaging an artifact, and the cultural or institutional legitimacy that's required or assumed to be present when someone is using an artifact. As Hughes notes, systems should be scoped subjectively, and Considering this, what constitutes a subsystem at one level of analysis might function as a system at another. And so I scale Davis's mechanisms and conditions of affordance framework up to the systems level. This allows us to consider how systems afford outputs variably, depending on factors such as the cultural and institutional legitimacy of some users and populations. And in this framework, one could argue that low institutional legitimacy in systems of energy production, consumption, and byproduct disposal, for instance, could lead to scenarios of environmental inequality, while higher institutional legitimacy may yield environmental privilege. The second limitation of a Hughes systems approach that I'd like to address is the recognition that culture plays a large role in defining system features such as institutional legitimacy. Hughes made space for such considerations with reference to what he called technological style that a system is implemented with. I argue that much is missed by simply relegating cultural components of large technical systems to the style with which they're implemented. Extending and reformulating this use of culture, then, I argue, allows cultural and social dynamics, such as those used to determine and guide prevailing social values and establish social hierarchies, should be seen as central organizing components in the development, implementation, and function of large socio-technical systems. It is culture that plays a prevailing role in determining what counts as dexterity in system use, what is worth perceiving, and who holds the legitimacy to influence the design and implementation of physical artifacts in that system. To make these dynamics more easily interpretable, I follow Ruha Benjamin and position race along many other social constructs as technologies themselves that are both implicitly and actively integrated into the larger socio-technical systems that humans invest in and rely so deeply upon. That is, I follow Ruha Benjamin in understanding many elements of culture as social technologies that provide, quote, means to sort, organize, and design social structure. Therefore, as been argued elsewhere, notions of race, gender, class, and other dimensions of identity and social hierarchy are drivers of socio-technical momentum or displacement paradoxes in a way that's similar to the effect that a financial exchange technology or regulatory environment might have on how a technology functions once it's, quote unquote, in the wild. As such, social and cultural processes of technology must not only be recognized as components of large socio-technical systems, but they should also likely be understood as contributing to its overall momentum. Now, turning to the question of momentum itself, in this modified Hughes socio-technical system framework, complexity is often argued to be a signifier or a characteristic that leads to the presence of momentum. For Hughes, this complexity is somewhat flat, suggesting that it's equivalent to a system's mass or the number of actors. And for others who came later, like Cohen, using actor network theory as a point of intervention, the complexity is not just a result of mass, but also of the structure of the actor network or the large socio-technical system itself, where, quote, a network is durable not only because of the durability of the bonds between the points that it has that compose it, but because each of its points constitutes a durable and simplified network itself. To clarify and highlight the importance of these dynamics to understanding socio-technical momentum, I want to draw upon one biological metaphor. I know this is risky, that of canalization. Canalization was introduced by Conrad Waddington in 1942 to explain the dynamics by which morphological stability tended to prevail over long periods of evolutionary time, despite constant genetic mutations and processes of natural selection. He thought this was a trait that was selected for, but more recent research has suggested it's a result of the structure of a genetic network, where deeply connected network nodes end up being hard to displace, you could say. In this framework, one could say that there is momentum there is momentum to current energy production systems that is driven by deeply canalized notions of social hierarchy and value, such as race, and that these notions allow for benefits of energy production, such as electricity, to be widely distributed or afforded for, while the costs, such as exposure to environmentally extractive dynamics, for instance, are narrowly afforded to groups with low institutional legitimacy. So there are four themes that I'd like to highlight from this exploration briefly, because I know I'm low on time. First, systems theory can be extremely useful in helping us understand how social and environmental systems are related to each other. They use the word again, but they have important limitations that need to be navigated. I argue here that there are good tools to do so, but they need to be usefully articulated into existing or novel frameworks to overcome hyperfocus on stability, uniformity, and traps of teleology. Second, while much ink has been spilled in environmental sociology concerning the relative importance of material versus cultural phenomena and understanding how social systems fit into natural ones, this task may not yet be done. And rather than focusing so intently on the right way to understand the construction of socio-technical systems, it may be beneficial to take a pluralist view and better theorize how cultural phenomena facilitate or transform into material ones and vice versa. Third, and finally, displacement and systems thinking more generally, especially when considered as being articulated with ecological or asocial processes and dynamics, beg the question of what level of analysis it's most appropriate to consider causation at. What's the appropriate way to conceptualize cause in a highly integrated socio-technical system that, quote, tends to be less shaped by societies and more shaping of them, quote, as they grow larger and more complex? In the framework put forth here, one might say that systems always develop and change as results of human agents in them, but as they become more structured, the force of the mechanisms with which they encourage, discourage, request, demand, refuse, and allow certain social actions grows, and the distribution of likely social actions becomes more constrained or kurtotic. No, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and heroically done on your phone. So we have a final discussion. Benjamin,
Thanks. And I actually do have slides, but I promise to be quick.
Oh,
You can hear me
amazing.
okay? That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I just couldn't resist the chance to actually share about Thomas Hughes, since I know Patrick is kind of pushing neo-Hughesian approaches. And so this is the Hughes book, by the way, and you can tell I'm a bit old. This book is almost as old as I am. So it does kind of give you a hint for how long sociologists and historians of technology have been thinking about systems. It's a great book for you to get with MIT Press, and it's also half history. So whether Hughes was a sociologist or a historian is kind of debatable, and he does have these great notions like socio-technical systems, which he calls the seamless web, which is something Patrick said. It's really hard to dissemble the social artifacts from the technological infrastructure, and momentum, which is the kind of the term we use now is path dependence, or lock-in, carbon lock-in. It's expanded a bit since the time of Hughes to kind of get more nuanced. So this is a nice diagram that a colleague made showing the socio-technical system for cars. And what's neat, in science technology studies, you call the technology the artifact. Sounds great that way, right? And so you can see, the kind of hint is, if you want to understand automobiles, the car, the vehicle, is just one piece of the system. You have all these other elements, epistemic, material, resource-based, spatial, temporal, that shape what that vehicle does, even down to things like speeding tickets and insurance regulations, and how you design pedestrian crossings and traffic lights. And what's complicated about this is that it co-evolves. So if you change any one of these elements, you could actually affect the whole system. And it really fights against narrow thinking. If you only study cars, or you only study industry, or you only study roads, you're missing all the other elements of the system. So it's a real call for pluralism, complexity, and multidimensionality, which, if you want a kind word, makes it complex. If you want an unkind word, it makes it messy, because the system boundary is very hard to draw. Another way of applying socio-technical systems thinking is my colleague Frank Giels, who calls the multi-level perspective. This is also a socio-technical framework. So within the literature, like many different types of frameworks, this is kind of neat. Again, it shows cars, but it shows them competing against niches and regimes, shaped again by exogenous factors like the landscape. And this is another highly popular theory in science technology studies. So what does this do? And Patrick was really good at kind of teasing you at the end with what systems thinking can maybe bring to the discussion. And I see at least 6 implications that maybe are novel, maybe not, maybe you find them very mundane. I think the first one is that, like, looking backwards, the systems we have now seem like they were inevitable and determined, but at the time they were being developed, they were very contingent. Right? We didn't know the car would take off the way it did. We didn't know electricity would take off the way it did, right? So it really challenges technological determinism, that the technologies that are dominant today are dominant inevitably. In fact, there's a continual process of negotiation that gets solidified as the system evolves. Secondly, and this is something that Patrick does a great job, values, politics, racism, patriarchy, colonialism get built into the technology. Technologies are also ways of ordering social structure and political power, which is another nice way of putting the social in front of the technology. Another element that Patrick didn't talk so much about is that we get enfolded into these networks that become invisible. And you mentioned Langdon Venner, Patrick. He also uses this term, technological somnambulism, which is a fancy term for sleepwalking, that we become so engrossed in these infrastructures, we don't even realize they exist. And if you ask a child born today, what is new technology, they would not say the iPhone, the road, the electricity network, because they were born into a world in which those are naturalized. Patrick did a great job mentioning actors. Actors play a key role as well. Those are called system builders or intermediaries in Hughesian terms. They also struggle over challenges, and to use Hughes's term, reverse salient, where they create intractable problems that sometimes kill a system like streetcars or rail networks from actually proliferating more than they did. The fifth one, almost done, is failure. That when technologies fail, even down to like the Challenger disaster, it isn't necessarily the O-ring in the booster rocket. It's more of the political culture of NASA that put a launch politically ahead of schedule, right, for other social reasons, right? And so you have technologies that can be very good technically, the natural gas turbine car, the AT&T picture phone. Gosh, anyone remember Betamax video recorders, right? Or laser discs? They work fantastically, but they fail socially for other reasons beyond the technology. And lastly, and this is for students, Hughes and systems thinking gives you a good heuristic device. It breaks down dimensions of technology into technical, economic, political, cultural, and so forth, behavioral. And that's a really useful way of getting my students to unpack what technology is. I wanted to quickly allude how hot and current systems thinking is. So in this piece, it's published in a top STS journal with David Hess, who's a sociologist, very good sociologist, in my opinion. And this was just done a few years ago. You'll like this, Patrick. We interviewed 35 scholars across different disciplines, including political science, STS, anthropology, history, etc. And we asked them, gosh darn it, what's the best theory for understanding socio-technical change? And those 35 theorists gave us 96 theories. 96! And you can see sociology is actually in the minority. A lot of the theories coming from behavioral science, a lot of theories coming from STS, innovation studies, and information science. And what's really interesting is that we give you in this article the list of all 96, so you can look it up. They're numbered 1 through 96, where we tell the discipline, the name, the authors, as well as how it applies to acceptance. But then we arbitrarily chose the most popular theories, and if they were mentioned by 10% of our interviewees, it's a very arbitrary number, that at least gets you a more manageable list of 14. And here is that short list, and you can see Hughes and large technical systems is still very much relevant today, even though it was a theory developed 3 or 4 decades ago. You can also see some of the other elements of STS that Patrick mentioned. Actor network theory, which is not the same as Hughes, is there at 8. And other elements like justice theory, which I know Patrick has written about in his own work, is also there. Whether it's a theory or a heuristic or a framework is debatable, of course. So, and then lastly, I liked that Patrick, this is my last slide, gave us more questions than answers, and I charted 4 that I think he has a really nice platform for. Number 1, he does this nice framing around paradoxes. But how does coupling systems thinking help us understand those paradoxes? Are they more intractable and wicked? Does it give us heuristics to overcome them? I really like he asked this hard question of, what value does STS still have for environmental sociology and vice versa, right? Because these are very different epistemic communities. I really like the focus on values, especially race and the work of Benjamin, right? These co-evolve with material infrastructure, and how do we then dislodge racist technology? That is an actual follow-on to what Patrick was asking. And lastly, he mentioned this at the end, systems also become coupled or layered. Hughes calls first-order, second-order systems, right? What does this mean for how we break apart systems that we don't want? So I think those are some really good questions that follow on from Patrick's essay, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. All right. So our last presentation, sort of big picture remarks from Richard York. And Richard, you can just unmute. I'm going to spotlight you. You can go ahead whenever you can.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here and, of course, to share a virtual panel with so many outstanding scholars. I think you'll find that my comments appropriately echo many things you've heard today, and I think that we collectively have a lot of continence and connection in our thoughts. I think one of the central themes of all of the speakers is recognizing the importance of historical thinking and historical approaches, but not just in a backward-looking sense, but really in a very much a how do we think about the future and what is possible, and in fact, expanding our horizons about what is possible. And an emphasis on the nature of contingency, and in one sense, and I will refer to both of these, about the world as a whole, that the world that we live in could have been other. I'd also think a central part of that, in our small little world of sociology, the discipline of sociology could have been fundamentally different. And in fact, I think that is the theme of those who call for decolonizing sociology, that there's no naturalistic reason that we need to have had the focus on the scholars we did, the topics we did, that even though there are common themes we discuss and look at, those were historically created. I think that's in a sense to really recognize that no disciplines are naturalistic. There's no essential way they were supposed to be, that we could have made different boundaries. And in that sense, then, it is odd, but not necessary that in the environment that ecological thinking was not central to the foundation of sociology. And I think that's actually a really important part to recognize that some of the speakers today have noted. In some ways, climate change changes everything, but in fact, it is the same situation we have always been in. All societies have always been part of ecosystems. We have always been fundamentally entwined with and dependent on the other creatures on this earth. And in fact, I think if we recognize that modernity from its very start has been in a period of very rapid environmental change. And often we focus on the dramatic changes in Europe caused by industrialization, but of course recognize that those were founded on the rapid colonial project that was figuratively and quite literally burning the rest of the earth. So we have always been under a red sky, that sociology has always been a red sky sociology, whether or not we actually acknowledged it. So I think a central lesson I would take for our discipline is that we should not be obsessed with boundary keeping. And I know that's a common frustration many of us who work on the environment have found. I sometimes might call it the tyranny of the literature review, that to publish to a sociological audience, one must frame whatever one has to say in a way that fits with what is considered sociology, often by the disciplinary elites. And I think that we need to move beyond that type of thinking to not only expand the bounds of sociology, but perhaps not to worry quite so much about what counts as sociology, maybe to see ourselves more as scholars, intellectuals, citizens, and people, rather than simply as sociologists. In fact, I think that fits with the idea of public sociology, is focusing on the ability to speak plainly, to be able to make our arguments from a point of view that can be understood by an intelligent listener or reader, rather than show that they fit with what is considered the sociological tradition. But now, with making some kind of snipes there at sociology, I want to say, I of course think that the tradition of sociology has many profound and important insights. And I am regularly reminded of that when I talk to non-sociologists in their analyses of the environment. I think sociology's, some of its key insights is moving beyond the shallowness of individualist explanations of all phenomena, of recognizing the power and importance of structures. And even though it is a cliche we teach in our intro classes, there is something profoundly meaningful about the sociological imagination. So I think that imagination is where I will start to bring this, what I have to say, to a close. That we should use the insights of sociology not to constrain what we can talk about by defining boundaries, but to enable broader discussions and broader insights. And so coming then from the theme of sociology could have been different. And of course, back to a point others have made, the world itself could have been very different. And that actually should open up some degree of hope. I often find it frustrating when many of those of us who look at the crises we face propose what are seen as radical solutions. the common refrain is that those things are not possible. But I would note that a central thing of modernity has been envisioning things that seem impossible, but maybe were not. And I find it remarkable the things that can be envisioned. So, for example, my generation that grew up at the tail end of the Cold War grew up where we spent so much time envisioning the end of the world in a nuclear annihilation. We also, on other sides, have always had it as part of the modern project, envisioning the colonization of space. We also have, I've seen this, the AI focus of envisioning the singularity where we merge with computers. Surely if we can envision those things, we could not only envision a world of green capitalism and electric cars, we could envision a world without cars, without capitalism, perhaps a world without animal agriculture where billions of animals are constrained in tiny confined operations and slaughtered each year. Perhaps we could envision a world without nuclear weapons, a world without militaries, and a world without injustice. And I don't mean in the sense to be simply utopian, but to say that the central part of our project could be to use a larger imagination. So with that, I will end with saying maybe the big question for sociology that I think in part has always been there is not only envisioning these things, but asking the question of how do we get there? Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much, Richard. Jordan, you want to take over?
Sure. I'm just want to say before we get to Q&A, just how blown away I am at the interest and the speakers, the presenters, the commentators. It really was such a thrill. So thank you all so much for being here. We have 2 questions in the Q&A. I guess maybe before those, there was a quick announcement from Christoph about submitting your work to a ASA mini conference that's in the chat there on climate and society. If you want to look at that. But beyond that, I'll go to the Q&A. And if you have a question you want to type in, there should be a little button there at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And the first is from Apollonia Porticelli. Great presentation. This is for Dan Cohen. With this idea of terraforming, I can't help but think of Cli-Fi, especially the work of Ursula Le Guin. Do you draw any theoretical inspiration from Cli-Fi, especially as it intersects with issues of inequality? Octavia Butler's work also comes to mind. So Dan, I'll let you respond.
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much, Apollonia, for the question. Yes, I mean, I think my thinking about planetary and terraforming really comes from reading almost every Kim Stanley Robinson book during COVID. We all had to cope in our own way. But Stan is very interested in decolonial thinking, but is not, I think, the most profound writer on inequality. I think there's Ursula Le Guin is terrific. Octavia Butler is fantastic. I'm most interested as a reader in kind of more subtle versions of Cli-Fi. 2 books that I think really stand out for me are Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones, which is a book about a Black family in the South, kind of hit by Katrina, which never mentions the word climate change. But Jesmyn Ward, the author, is very engaged on these issues. It's really great. And then a more recent novel, Lydia Kiesling's Mobility. And I think that's kind of, these novels are both, I think, about the kind of like social life of the climate breakdown in ways that are helpful to us as sociologists, because they remind us that the social life of the climate breakdown usually doesn't have the words climate change stamped all over it. And that's therefore a guide, I think, methodologically to thinking more expansively about this problem at the kind of intimate and everyday scale.
Thank you, Dan. So the next question comes from Tonya Hay. It's for Julie Schor. There's a little background. I work in the space of human dimensions of climate and natural resources, with most of my disciplinary training in rural sociology, but more recently my training is much more interdisciplinary. I appreciate Julia's concern that many of those us in the interdisciplinary space, things are skipping around on me, lack sophistication of theory and methods related to social processes and problems. Any advice from you all for avoiding both simplistic and kind of reinventing wheels as we try to move forward? So Julie?
Yeah. So first of all, I think if you've been trained in rural sociology, you don't really have to worry about the sort of thing that I was talking about. But I would say just two things. One is if you're trying to move into an area where you don't have a background, maybe the first thing to do might be to try and collaborate with someone in that area. So you sort of pick things up through that collaboration. But what I found, I made that quip about engineers and consumption, is there's just a certain level of arrogance that these folks have had about the topic, and often they sort of approach it just from their own discipline as if it's just like an engineering problem versus a sort of cultural, like total failure to understand the cultural dimensions of consumption. So that's just, I think, intellectual arrogance, and avoiding that is probably the most important thing.
Great, perfect. All right, Benjamin Sovacool raised hand. Okay, Benjamin, go right ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that comment from Juliet, and I think there's two other things that are interesting. In political science, there's what's called the ladder of abstraction for theory. That big grand theories, like systems theories, have a huge lens, but they aren't so good on details. And small micro theories are really good on details and like falsifiable hypotheses, but miss the big picture. And there is no right or wrong. You just have to move up and down that ladder of abstraction to match your goals. The other thing is a confession. When I chose Thomas Hughes for my PhD, along with other theories, the reason I did it is because my supervisor told me to, right? And so I think there's a real problem with how we select theory sometimes. And the fact that we found those 96 theories has pushed me to argue for a new thing called theoretical triangulation, where you test a problem or a research question with multiple theories to ignore some of those biases that come with just using one theory or one approach. And if you're a rural sociologist, I would encourage you to think about theories beyond rural sociology. And if you're not a rural sociologist, to consider theories in rural sociology.
There you go, beautiful. Okay, there's one more question in the chat, but it's kind of for, I think, for everybody. So I might take the host, whatever prerogative, and ask a question if you guys are okay with that. And that's for Rebecca. We're talking about memory, landscape, decay, British context. My mind goes to W.J. Sebald's work. I'm not familiar with Sebald at all. He was one of the most beautiful writers of the late and early 20th century. And, he helps me to think through these larger questions of colonialism and decay and time. And then along with Jeff's comments about thinking past timescales that we currently have, I was wondering if you can maybe respond to that a little bit more into kind of what, I guess, within the context that you're talking about, what remains, why, and the kind of choices we make within that, perhaps beyond the long delay timescale.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe the first thing to say is that, I was very honored and humbled to be invited to participate in an ASA Theory session, but I work and I think very inductively and empirically initially, and so it's hard for me on some level to offer the kind of fully baked theoretical contention without having done this field work, which is meant to begin in fall. But having made that disclaimer, I think part of what interests me about this as a site is precisely these questions about like those sorts of versionings of history that end up meaning something. So the other set of points that I had to leave out was about climate change, not just as a set of material impacts, which I think involves us in thinking about the true kind of long timescales, if we're thinking about the kind of actual history of climate change and thinking about the material historical legacies of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization and through to the Industrial Revolution and so forth. But climate change is also, as Mike Hulme, I think, puts it, a versatile and useful explanation for things. So part of what I'm also interested in is how climate change becomes a way to basically motivate and justify the things that heritage organizations always want to do, which is preserve a particular version of the past. And I think in the UK, you know, there's been good historical and geographical work by geographers about this. You know, it's a kind of very Victorian project. And so thinking about the kind of layerings of those two timescales, and the way that climate change kind of enters as an actors category. You know, the people in this story are very much talking explicitly in the language of climate change and what they mean by it, and reading that against, you know, what we know to be true about the kind of geoclimactic developments of the last several centuries.
Awesome, thank you. Maria Actrin has a question in the chat that's kind of for everybody. So maybe I'll just, Patrick had a question that's maybe for you, then we can broaden it out. How does sociology effectively bring together the study of climate change and environmental uncertainty with central concerns in the discipline? Kind of the overall theme of this panel here. So does capitalism the study of ethno-racial inequality? To what extent do environmental and climate justice frameworks hold the most potential for bringing these concerns together? And where do they fall short? All right, Patrick. You're still muted, Patrick.
I said, I'm glad you gave me that very, very easy question at the end. No, no, I think with like, how does engagement with the environment facilitate our ability to better understand social processes? I think in many different ways, right? Like Benjamin said this in response to my brief spiel, and I said it within there that I think it's critical to have a pluralist approach to developing our understanding of social and environmental relationships, where we're able to scale up and down that level of abstraction as we need to, and to not take any one theory or discipline, as Richard alluded to earlier, too terribly seriously. We're going to have to look at this from many different dimensions. And the science that, for instance, like Rebecca was just referring to, that we're building so much of our work upon and that we're using to benchmark, say, how people are understanding or considering these things as they design, the systems or the artifacts that I'm interested in, itself is mired in a good deal of uncertainty. We by no means know, as far as I understand or am aware, what's going to happen as a result of climate change yet. And so we should be particularly, I think, humble in the social sciences. I also would argue, back to Juliet's point about engineers, that they should be humble as well about these things, about trying to really communicate our uncertainties well when we're talking to policy actors. I'll use that like very broad term to refer to constituents and like more formal decision makers as well, because it's really easy for us to project certainty as a result of, I work quantitatively a lot, so as a result of quantitative analysis, when in fact there's layers and layers and layers of uncertainty that our estimates are built upon. And it's far too easy to hide that away by just discussing one single point estimate from your analysis.
That's perfect. Dan, go ahead. I'm sorry, Jed.
Oh, thank you. And I'm so thrilled and honored to be on in this group. I didn't say that earlier. I think that for me, I didn't put this in the panel in the presentation because not time, but basically I'd say there's like maybe an equation for climate social science, which is like part A is a technical field that you maybe get from engineering, carbon footprinting, whatever, times B, the relevant sociological subfield that you bring to it, or multiple, gets you like C, climate social science or something. And I think, to me, in a way, the big challenge is balancing those two. And to Julie's point, and I think Richard made this point, and others have made it too, like, if you don't bring in that sociological subfield knowledge, you have just extremely thin social science. And there's examples of this all over the place. I think the challenge in a way is, how do you balance those two? And then where does the kind of contribution land? And I think to Richard's point at the end, there's a difficulty, which is that the sociological elite of the discipline is always going to want that contribution to be framed in terms of prevailing conversations about sociology. And the invitation, I think, for us is to say there's like a different contribution space. But there's enormous resources in sociology and in its subfields, I think, to tackle climate problems. So the question is, how do you activate that in a way that is dynamic and productive, I think.
Perfect. Thank you. Julie?
So Maria, this is to Maria Acturian's question, where I think basically that that sort of capitalism, ethno-racial inequality, I think that is the space, that is the space to work in. But I'll answer the last part of your question, which is where does it fall short? I think where we have been less successful is on the culture side. So understanding the cultural dimensions of these. I think the material interest side, we've done a lot more. And in a way, just because we're getting close to time, I'm going to jump ahead to Mary Camerata's question. College student in environmental sciences. Wonderful that you are here, Mary. You have hit the nail on the head in terms of I think, a question that we don't have a good answer to, which is why isn't society more concerned? I think the psychologists tried to answer it and they've come up with, sort of really bad answers that are pretty easily falsifiable. I think you have political economy answers, which are more about interests, which work a lot for people with strong material interests. But I think for understanding everyday people, we don't really know the answer to that. We say they're in denial, but why? What does that mean? How? It's a really important question to work on. Thank you.
Thank you. We're about 5 minutes from time. We're 4 minutes from time. Caleb has a question here at the end. I know there's at least two others, but maybe this is a nice way to end, perhaps. One way to respond to the provocation of sociology's big questions to think about the content of the questions, concepts. But I'm curious if any of the speakers would like to reflect on how climate change necessitates different styles of theorizing. Does or should it change how or we theorize, think, or write? Then once we have some responses to this, we can stay after and continue the discussion for those who want to stay. But any of the presenters, respondents, or anyone else want to respond to that?
We're gonna make Caleb answer that next week.
Oh, Caleb would provide a good answer, wouldn't he?
I'm actually gonna brag on Daniel, actually, because I think this is something that Daniel is very energetically and led many of us in sociology to think about, and the work, and maybe this is just an invitation for Daniel to talk about the stuff that he's done with the Climate and Community Project and things like that. I mean, Richard concluded with this point about public sociology, and I think this is just one more arena in which that tradition is very vital. And the reading of public sociology, I mean, there are many different readings about public sociology and many disagreements about what it is, but one of them is that actually it's, the problems as people experience them, is the people that Juliet was talking about actually are what give us our questions, not what other sociologists are arguing about in our journals. And so I think that's one way to kind of bring those threads together.
Wonderful. Anybody else want to respond there? Oh, Richard.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the central things there is to, obviously it's content. One of the issues is content, is bringing in ecological theorizing, is not understanding ecological processes as independent of social processes. But I also think a theme that I came across a lot of people who spoke here is more focusing on deeper history. And that was, I think, a sharp point made by a number of people, that we have too much shallow history, that we really need to see at the longer longue durée. So I do think those would actually very much transform what even counts as a sociological theory, and I think we need that kind of approach.
All right, perfect. We're just at time before this final minute. Again, I'm going to stay. I was going to stay to answer the remaining questions from Chris and Jed and others. But just as a reminder, same time next week, part 2. We're going to have the same format again with all new discussants and speakers and concluding remarks. Hilary Angelo, William Sewell, Monteo Jayasankar, Ito Taveri, Caleb Scoville, Fernando Dominguez Rubio and Liz Clemens will be here, and we are just as thrilled to welcome them next week. So I hope most of you can join us. And with that, it's 12:30 here on the East Coast of the United States. But that will conclude it. But again, we'll stay afterward for more questions if those who can make it. So thank you all so much. Okay, now moving into extra time. Chris Gibson for Rebecca. Rebecca, you're still here. I really enjoyed your presentation. I look forward to reading your work on this topic. I'm curious how the idea of nostalgia enters your framing, if at all. Appreciating your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, of course, nostalgia is something that people who've, not just in the kind of sociology of climate change, but in the sort of philosophy of climate, if such a thing can be said to exist, have also reflected on. We've coined new words for it, the particular sort of variants of nostalgia that seem operative when we're thinking about climate. So I'm thinking of solastalgia, the mourning of a place that is kind of eroding but not yet gone. So yeah, absolutely. And I think being precise exactly about what people are nostalgic for, I think is interesting and revealing, and will certainly teach me a lot more about Britain than I know yet. But yeah, it's obviously extremely relevant.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. So Juliet, go ahead.
You can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I had just a few comments. I had a philosophy professor who taught English analytic philosophy, taught Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein, according to him, said the data is always already in, which is of course untrue, but important. And I just wanted to reflect a bit on Patrick Greiner's comments that we really don't understand what's going to happen. That kind of a statement, it seems to me, plays into the do nothing camp, the status quo camp. It has public political implications. I mean, it may be, there's a certain amount of truth to it, but a more productive point would be to say something like, this is what will happen if nothing else is done. Anyway, I just wanted to leave it at that. The other thing is I agree with Richard York about this focusing on the already done history of the literature. It's in the internet age, we can, our comments as sociologists may or may not be used in public sociology or insofar as they impact the ongoing political discussions. Because the assumption tends to have been in academic sociology that we're just writing for each other and that the public will not know what we're saying. Whereas if you assume that that what you're writing or what you're saying is being overheard by people like Lindsey Graham or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, then it becomes a different kind of ball game. And I'll just leave it at that. And thanks very much for inviting me to listen in.
Thank you.
And I'm going to sign off. There's another Zoom coming up. I mean, it's already started at noon.
Okay.
Hope to see you next week.
Forward to it. Thank you. Great. So I think that is it. I don't see more questions in the chat or anything like that. So again, thank you all for staying a little bit over time. This, was just such a thrill to have you all here. This all came together so well. And so thanks again. Next week, the thrilling conclusion of this. All right. Till then.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.